To the stage, Carl Tutt Jr. from 100 Black Men of Chicago.
Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for being here for this afternoon's event. It's going to be a quick event, but it's going to be impactful. And so we want to make sure that we're listening, that we understand what the candidates are saying, how they're feeling towards this next stage in the life of the city of Chicago, this historic stage in the life of the city of Chicago. And so I'm not going to waste a lot of time. I want to get things moving as quickly as possible. And I'd like to bring out our moderator for this afternoon's event. We have an award-winning journalist, someone that you know, that you listen to, hopefully, every Sunday, Darryl Dennard from iHeart Media and V103.
Thank you, Carl. And also, I would add there a proud member of the 100 Black Men of Chicago. First of all, we want to thank all of you for your participation here. This is a forum. It is not a debate. And what I'm going to ask is that we maintain a level of decorum with regard to the responses that we're going to receive from the candidates as they present their platforms for one of the most, if not the most, important municipal election in the city of Chicago's history. So what am I really asking for? I'm asking that you don't ooh and ah and respond to what the candidates have to say, that you hold your applause until the end. That also allows us to get as many questions as we possibly can. We have been able to receive questions from many of you that are in attendance. We're going to ask those questions, and if we have time, at the end, we'll open it up to the floor for some questions from the floor. It's my distinct pleasure right now to serve as moderator and also introduce the candidates. We're going to start first with Cook County Board President Toni Preckwinkle. Toni Preckwinkle, come on, what's up? This is not like Pavlov's dog, this is like a thing where we're asking you to, hold the applause. Toni Preckwinkle made history as the first African-American alderman of Chicago's 4th Ward and the first African-American and first woman to be Cook County Board President, running the nation's 2nd largest county. To first be elected alderman, she took on the machine and the Old Boys Club, winning on her 3rd try in 1991. As alderman, Toni has represented the needs of her community for 19 years, ensuring that the streets were safe, schools were supported, and economic development opportunities were realized. She has fought for living wages, public education, and against payday lending, as well as gun violence. As Cook County Board President, she has overseen one of the nation's largest public health and hospital systems and one of the largest criminal justice systems and the largest forest preserve system in the country. Toni is a lifelong advocate for equality and equity, and through her work as County Board President, she has successfully expanded access to health care for some 350,000 people, brought bail reform to the criminal justice system, instituted juvenile justice reform, spearheaded a regional economic development strategy, and expanded employment opportunities for the young people of Cook County. Next, we have Lori Lightfoot, attorney Lori Lightfoot. She is an accomplished lawyer, police reform advocate, and independent reform candidate for mayor of Chicago. Lori has worked as an assistant U.S. attorney, a senior equity partner at Meyer Brown, I should say, and in leadership positions in the city departments that support small business and improve emergency response. Lori has also served as president of the Chicago Police Board, as chair of the Police Accountability Task Force, and on the boards of organizations including NARAL, as well as NARAL Illinois, ACLU Illinois, the Better Government Association, and the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform. Lori's experiences have prepared her to run the city with a commitment to uplifting every neighborhood, a passion for equality education, and a dedication to making sure every person can thrive regardless of who they are, who they know, or where they live. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you candidates to become the next mayor of the city of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot and Toni Preckwinkle. Just a little bit of the ground rules. I already mentioned the decorum aspect. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to respond to questions selected ahead of time, and I will also let you know where the questions are coming from. And as they do that, I don't know, I'll see whether or not we allow time for a 30-second rebuttal. We are going to start first with a question from Sierra Walker. She represents the organization called Live Free. In his last City of Chicago budget, Mayor Rahm Emanuel established the Mayor's Office of Violence Prevention. What plans would you incorporate to ensure the success of this office under your leadership, including to what extent you would fund it, and how well would you fund it? We'll begin with you, Madam President.
Thank you very much to all of the sponsors of this event and to Malcolm X. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be with you today. You know, violence prevention and criminal justice reform have been the hallmark of the last 8 years that I've served as Cook County Board President. We've reduced the jail population by 40%, focusing on those accused of nonviolent crimes. We've made investments in community-based organizations, not-for-profit organizations that focus on violence prevention, anti-recidivism, and restorative justice. And we've worked in Springfield with advocates like many of you in this room to make changes, particularly in the laws of impacting juveniles, reducing the crimes which send young people into adult courts, providing for automatic expungement for most crimes for juveniles, and raising the age of inclusion in the juvenile justice system from 17 to 18. And I'm proud of all those accomplishments, and they're the result of hard work with community-based organizations and activists, as well as our own government folks. And let me just say, we have some real challenges in the city of Chicago. When I was a teacher, I lost a student to gun violence. She was killed in a drive-by shooting. Everyone has the right to feel safe in their home and in their community. And we need to work to ensure that people are willing to collaborate with the police to address the violence that we face. That's the only way in which we can address that challenge. We can invest in shot spotters and cameras, but we really need to invest in community policing, better supervision of our officers, better training for our officers, and holding our officers accountable for solving our most serious crimes, particularly murders and shootings. And that's work that has to be done out of the mayor's office, out of a criminal justice office or an office of violence prevention.
Time's up.
And we need to fund it really well.
And were you able to put a monetary amount to the budget item itself?
In New York and Los Angeles, they've been spending in similar offices $30 to $35 million a year.
Okay, sounds very good. Attorney Lightfoot, I'll pose the question to you again. And it says, in his last City of Chicago budget, Mayor Emanuel established the Mayor's Office of Violence Prevention. What would your plans be to ensure the success of this office under your leadership, and to what extent would you fund it, as well as how would you fund it?
Well, I have to say that I'm a little disappointed after 7 years, countless number of lives that have been lost to violence, 23,000 people shot, that finally in his final budget, the mayor has provided resources to address the scourge of gun violence, but frankly, it's too little. That's specifically why I propose in our comprehensive public safety plan a mayor's office for public safety. Right now, there are about 2 people in the mayor's office who focus on public safety. Now, not just policing, but public safety. 2 people full-time. When you compare that with New York that has about 50, or Los Angeles that has about 30, it's hard to say that we're taking this issue with the seriousness that it deserves. My plan is to be much more expansive and comprehensive than what's been proposed. We have to make sure that city resources, every tool and lever that we can pull, is focused on the full array of public safety. We need to make sure that we have people focused on the victim witness community. That is a growing community, unfortunately. We have to make sure that we have an office that's focused on the thousands of people and returning citizens that are coming back into Chicago every single month. We need to also make sure that we are focused on the underlying causes of violence and make sure that city government is focused on this public health crisis. So what the mayor has proposed is a step, but it's far from what is necessary to make sure that we are dealing with this issue and have the resources and the focus to really combat not only gun violence, but the full array of public safety needs of the city.
And I'll pose that same question that I asked Madam Preckwinkle, and that is, how much money are we talking about?
Well, the dollars are probably about right, about 20 million. But really what we're talking about is repurposing some of the focus. Absolutely, we're going to be adding people. We need to have public health specialists, counselors, and people who are experts in local policing as well.
Thank you. The next question is from Cedric McKay, a member of the 100 Black Men of Chicago. And he says, research from government and foundations alike are clear the attrition rate for black boys attending Chicago public schools demonstrates a persistent, systematic disparity. This can create an impression of a population who is less valued. What are the policies and resources which your administration would employ to address this long-standing and dismal black boy achievement and graduation gap? And I can tell you from personal experience of spending the majority of my adult life, it happens actually very early. We'll begin with you, Lori Lightfoot.
I appreciate the question because there's a lot of conversation around the achievements that CPS has made, particularly over the last few years, and the focus is on almost exclusively test scores and high school graduation rates. But if you dig into the numbers, you find precisely the problem that the questioner asked, which is what's happening with young black boys in the system? And the answer is they're not making the kind of progress that other folks are. I think what we have to do, and that's what I've outlined in our education plan, is a number of different things. First, CPS has to think about its policies and prescriptions through a racial and equity lens. We need to use those tools in thinking about how we focus on priorities and resources. We also need to make sure that we are rebuilding our neighborhood schools. There are too many of our people who are just simply being left behind because of racial disparities, because of the imbalance caused by the student headcount funding formula. But we also need to make sure that we are focusing on children at the early stages of their life. That's precisely why we propose a pilot program that looks at early childhood education that builds in the families and young infants and toddlers so that by the time they get to kindergarten, they have the tools and skills that they need to be successful. We can't expect that we essentially have very little impact and influence in their lives at the earliest stages, and then by the time they get to kindergarten, we're magically going to be able to transform them. I think that the better strategy is to spend more resources investing in these children at the early stages of life to build them on a pipeline for success instead of a pipeline to prison and other untoward consequences.
Madam President, same question.
Well, I'm a teacher by profession, and I know the importance of good public education. And as I've talked to people around the city, this is a universal concern. We need to fund our neighborhood schools well, and many of our neighborhood schools are under-resourced. You can pretty much predict the performance in our public schools by zip code, and that's a tragedy. We need to invest in our neighborhood public schools, and we need to invest in early childhood education. We know that programs like Head Start historically have shown long-term, longitudinal benefits to the young people who are in those programs. And we have to work to be sure that more of our young people have access to early childhood education. And, let me talk about elementary schools for a minute. Nationally, they predict prison populations on the basis of third grade achievement. So people who are falling behind in third grade are more likely to end up in our criminal justice system. And we have to address that challenge. And the kinds of supports that our neighborhood elementary schools need should not be based on a funding formula that's per pupil. It should be based on need. Because in many of our communities, the young people need bilingual support, they need social workers, they need psychologists, they need wraparound services to ensure their success. And we need to provide those services in our under-resourced schools to be sure that our kids succeed. We need to be sure that the elementary schools are strong, and we need to continue programs like Freshmen on Track in high school that monitors performance in that first critical year. Because what happens if the kids fail their biology class, for example, they're on a path to not getting out of high school. And Freshman on Track is a great idea. We need to invest in programs that ensure that the first year in high school, the kids learn the study skills that they need to succeed in high school, and that they're able to continue on towards success. And we've got to look at the both gender and racial disparities that we see in our public school system. Whites and Asians do better.
Time.
Whites and Asians do better. And if you look, there are differences between girls and boys. And of course, African American young men and Latinx young men do the worst in terms of performance.
Thank you very much. Also, this event is being streamed live across various social media platforms, and we ask that if you are tweeting, that you use the hashtag Community Striving for Peace and Prosperity, as well as the hashtag 100 Black Men Mayors Forum or Invest Mayors Forum. Moving on to the next question, we'll pose this to you, Madam President. What is your plan to help build and nurture an atmosphere of mutual respect between disheartened Chicago citizens of color and the Chicago Police Department? It's from Michael Myers, Kicks for the City.
I think it's really important to understand that the only way we can address the public safety challenges that our communities face is if there's greater collaboration between police and community. And what I've seen over time is disinvestment in community policing, which was a critical strategy to bring together police and community residents to help address the public safety challenges that our communities face. We have to focus on better police-community relations. And that involves not just community policing, but being sure that our police officers are better trained, that they get crisis intervention training, that they get use of force training. This is all part of the consent decree, but we can't focus simply on implementing the consent decree. We have to focus on police-community relations more broadly. We also need to hold our police officers accountable. You know, if we're not solving the murders and the shootings, the most violent crimes that our communities face, communities won't have confidence in the police, and that's a real challenge. But if we're really going to address the violence issues, we have to address the challenges that the communities that suffer from the most violence face. And these are communities that have the highest levels of unemployment in the city, the lowest levels of educational attainment. They have under-resourced schools. They're often food deserts. We have to look at community needs, community by community, and try to address them. And in particular, we have to focus on the communities that struggle most with the violence. We need to invest in them. And we also have to understand, as we do at the county, that this is a public health crisis that impacts our neighborhoods. We treat many, many gunshot victims. And what we found is if we can get the young men who come into our emergency room into a program that provides social-emotional support, they're less likely to return to the emergency room shot again, because once you're shot, you have an astronomical chance of being shot once again. So we need to address the victims of gunshots and violence in our communities, and we need to address the broader community needs as well.
Lori Lightfoot.
So I think the question is, what specific steps do we need to take to improve the relationship between the community and the police? I think there's a number of things that we have to do, but we have to start with acknowledging the fact that, unfortunately, we remain one of the most segregated cities in the country. That affects policing. Race does matter. And we have to think about that in the context of who we recruit, and how we train them, both the young officers and veteran officers. And let me give you a couple specific examples. New York, before young recruits go out on their duty of assignment, they meet with people in their neighborhoods in the daylight hours so that they form relationships with people and they see the texture and context of neighborhoods in a way that's different than what we do, which is we send people, young recruits, after they graduate from the academy, out in the midnight hours and say, here's your gun, here's your badge, go be the police. We're setting them up for failure. The cultural literacy and the nuance and history of our neighborhoods should be part of the thing that officers learn, not only in the academy, but when they move from one district to another, they should have community ambassadors that are part of that journey. People from the neighborhoods need to be part of the training that is being done. Now, CPD has a successful cultural program called procedural justice that's now embedded and mandatory within the consent decree, but we need to do more. And we need to do more than, frankly, send our officers to the DeSable Museum. We have to deal with the practical problem of race and policing. That means we also have to deal with that issue, particularly at the supervisor and the sergeant's level, where a lot of the culture of the police department lives. Sadly, if you go to the training academy over here on West Jackson, you walk in, whether it's a recruit class or a promotion class, you will see that they are still self-segregating by race. That's a huge problem that they have not addressed adequately enough, and that has consequences for the way that they perform on the street.
Also, I'm going to divert from the regular routine of just asking a question here and pose my own question, and I'm only going to give you 30 seconds to respond because it's important. It dovetails off of the answers you just gave. Would you keep Superintendent Eddie Johnson as police superintendent? Ms. Lightfoot.
What I've said is this. Between now and May 20th, when a new mayor gets sworn in, the police department has many important things to do, 3 of which are continue to keep our community safe, start the implementation of the consent decree, and start the planning for summer violence. It makes no sense to me, as has been recommended, to fire Eddie Johnson, make him a lame duck and his executive team, and add that instability before all those things are done. There'll be a time and a place to have that conversation, but it's after the summer, and we'll evaluate the job that he has done and whether or not we're on the same page and have the same vision.
Madam President.
I've said that we need a new superintendent in the police department. I haven't said that we'd do it the day I walked in the door. And let me just say, the challenges we face in the police department are around its culture and the embedded racism in our society. You know, we have to have a police superintendent who acknowledges that there's a code of silence in the police department and that there's racism in the police department. We've got to begin with that. And we've also, if we're going to address the challenges of public safety, bring together not just the police department, but the community-based organizations and activists who've worked so hard around these issues of police accountability to address the challenges we face in the summer and going forward.
This next question is from the Education Committee for the 100 Black Men of Chicago. It states the issue of closing local public schools while expanding charter schools has been controversial across the last 5 years or more. How would you ensure that the entire public school system is well funded and targeted to where the educational need is the greatest? We'll begin with you, Ms. Preckwinkle.
You know, it's really important that we fund our neighborhood public schools well. We cannot have a strong society unless we fund our schools well. And as I said, we have to change the funding formula. It can't just be per pupil. It has to be based on the needs that the communities face. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that up front. We've got high-performing schools in some communities. We've got under-resourced schools in others. And we really need to try to meet those challenges. I believe that education is an escalator, and that we need to support our neighborhood public schools. And that's what I did when I was alderman. I worked hard with principals and community activists to strengthen our schools, to bring programs into the schools, and also to provide facilities for the schools, expanding some of our schools, creating new schools. I had King High School, which was a basketball champion for years and years and years, and had some of the lowest test scores in the city. And I said to our public school leadership, I don't care whether they're basketball champions. We need a well-functioning school in this community. And they worked with me to do that. So I think we have to make investments in our schools that are based on need. We have to be focused on working with principals, parents, and community leaders to address the challenges that our schools face. Because if we don't do that, we can't have a world-class city. You cannot have a world-class city without strong neighborhoods, and you can't have strong neighborhoods without strong public schools. That's why, as alderman of the 4th Ward, I devoted so much of my time and attention and my staff's time and attention to building up our neighborhood schools. And let me just say, we face the challenge in the city of Chicago of vast racial disparities in the quality of public education.
The most precious jewel, which is their children. We need to create an environment where children are nurtured in a safe and nurturing environment in the classroom. That's got to be the primary focus. The other thing I'll say, and you know, I'm an old procurement geek, the CPS procurement system is fundamentally broken. When we are giving contracts to, for example, Aramark, and Sodexo Magic to clean our schools. They are utterly failing. The answer can't be give them another almost $300 million contract. So one of the things that we have to do to think about funding is make sure that we are being good fiscal stewards on the procurement side so that the monies there that we should be saving can be put back into the classroom.
Ms. Preckwinkle asked a question with regard to Superintendent Eddie Johnson. Have to ask it also with Chicago Public Schools CEO Janice Jackson. Would you retain her services?
Yes, I've said I would. And let me just say, you know, I have...
You have 30 seconds. Go ahead.
Sure. I have been a strong proponent of neighborhood public schools in my entire public life. And I want you to know that I was public about Mayor Rahm Emanuel's criticisms of teachers, implying that they were only in it for the money. And I was a public opponent of the closure of the 50 schools. It's a very public withdrawal of resources from neighborhoods when you close schools. And of those 50 schools that were closed, 38 of them are still vacant. And they're a daily reminder to the young people who walk past them every day to their new school and to adults who drive through the community that their community was disinvested in.
Janice Jackson?
Mm-hmm.
Look, I am very mindful of the fact that CPS has had 5 different CEOs in the last 7 years. No organization of any kind could be successful when you have that kind of instability at the top. Our kids are achieving despite that instability, but I'm very mindful of the fact. However, I have serious questions that I would need Janice Jackson to answer to my satisfaction. I'm profoundly unhappy with the way that she handled the sex abuse scandal, with not providing safety to our kids until after the Tribune broke the story, which was 5 months after she was on notice.
Moving on. The next question is from Haven Kyle. He's from Finger High School, and he's watching on the live stream right now. Thanks for doing that. It says South and West Side neighborhoods have been destroyed by abandoned buildings, poor maintenance of parks, food and transportation deserts, and a concentration of closed public schools. What will you do to invest in infrastructure and use the power of the mayor's office to address this crushing inequality? We'll begin with you, Lori Lightfoot.
Well, it's a great question, and as I've been traveling over the city over these last almost a year, and we're just down in Pullman today, you see the lack of investment and the devastation that that causes. And the mayor's office and the mayor has to lead on this issue. But where it has to begin is with a conversation with people in the neighborhoods to understand both the assets and the opportunities are there and how we use that investment to really add jet fuel to the activities that are already going on in these neighborhoods. We talk about this as if nothing is happening, but the fact is that there are neighborhood organizations, community development organizations that are doing yeoman work, often without recognition, often in silos. So I think that the job of the mayor is to make sure that you start the conversation with people in those communities about what their needs are, and then you use the tools like the opportunity funds, like TIF funds, like the neighborhood opportunity grants, which I think should be a true grant and not a matching grant, to really come up with a comprehensive plan for economic development and enrichment of neighborhoods. We have seen way too little, and where it's happened, it's been transactional. I want to make sure that we have a comprehensive plan to uplift the quality of our neighborhoods that's not merely transactional, but transformative, and that's got to start with talking to people in the neighborhoods whose lives are going to be most affected, and then using the resources of the mayor's office and the bully pulpit of the mayor's office to invest in the neighborhoods, invest in small businesses, improve the quality of our schools. But where it begins for me on this issue is we have to have a plan for violence. We are not going to be able to do the hard work that we need to in our neighborhoods when people feel like they're on lockdown and where fear is the constant companion of our children.
Ms. Preckwinkle? I can repeat the question, and you know the question. The question, once again, is about investment with regard to infrastructure in what is considered to be the forgotten sides of the city, south and west sides.
You know, I served as alderman for 19 years, and the work that I did in rebuilding neighborhoods, I think, translates into the kind of work that needs to be done now. We built 1,500 units of housing, most of it affordable rental housing in the 4th Ward during my tenure. Some of it mixed income. We worked with community residents. We worked with small and medium-sized developers. We worked with the Chicago Housing Authority. And as I said, we transformed the communities of North Kenwood, Oakland, Douglas, Grand Boulevard. And that was hard work, and it was work that we engaged the community in very significantly. You cannot wave a magic wand and accomplish this kind of work. You have to work with community residents, and that's what I did for almost 20 years. And let me just say, across the city, many of our communities have done the kind of ground-up planning that we need to base our redevelopment activities on. Some of it through the Local Initiative Support Corporation, the New Communities Program, but there are community plans out there that await investment in order to implement them. And that's the kind of transformative work that I did as alderman, and I think I have to lead as mayor of the city of Chicago. And we need investment in our neighborhoods, but we also need investment in infrastructure in these neighborhoods, particularly around transportation access. Many of our communities are isolated by lack of transportation access. It makes it hard for them to get to work, hard for them to get to school. So we have to invest in our public transit system if we're really going to provide economic opportunity. And we also have to address the violence issue. When I was alderman and people were thinking about moving into the ward, they asked me 2 questions. Are the schools good, and are the streets safe? And unless we can ensure that people have access to great public schools in all of our communities and that the streets are safe in our communities, we're not going to be able to deal with the decline in population that threatens the very survival of our city.
And I have to dovetail off of this disparity with regard to infrastructure funding, because the City Council right now, next month, is poised to vote on $1 billion TIF fund for Lincoln Yards. And very quickly, 30 seconds here, is that the right move, and should that project go ahead? We'll begin with you, Lori Lightfoot.
No, I've been very outspoken. That I think there's fundamental problems both with the process and with the content of that proposal. It should not move forward until there's new mayor and city council. Part of the problem is this is a mega city within a city. There have not been full public disclosure of the impact studies that supposedly are done that haven't been shared. There's not enough affordable housing. And the reality is this is one of the most valuable pieces of property in our city. It's going to be developed whether there's a nickel of city money put into it or not. We need to wait. We need to make that project much more transparent.
Ms. Preckwinkle?
You know, tax increment financing was an economic development tool designed to kickstart development in struggling neighborhoods. And yet we find in the city of Chicago, 31% of our property tax revenue now goes into these TIF districts. All of the downtown is in TIF districts. And developments like Lincoln Yards, where there's already a hot real estate market, and as Lori said, this is going to be developed anyway, get tremendous TIF benefits at the expense of all of our taxing bodies, particularly our public schools and city government. So I've expressed my opposition.
Sounds good. We have unanimity there. There are many young men and women in this city who are working hard to have meaningful careers, but they are hindered because their involvement with the criminal justice system. What change would you make to give these young people the opportunities they deserve for career-oriented employment? And this is from Tori Davison, who's with Story Catchers Theater. We'll begin with you first, Toni Preckwinkle.
We've done work in criminal justice in basically 3 arenas. Trying to reduce our jail population by reducing reliance on bond, cash bond, supporting community-based organizations that do anti-violence, anti-recidivism, and restorative justice work, and also focusing on changing the laws in Springfield. And I have to give credit to my former chief of staff, Kim Fox, who said, look, we're doing a lot of things internally in the county, but that's not enough. We have to go to Springfield and work with the advocates to change the laws for the state of Illinois. And we had great luck working with many of you in this room, frankly, changing the laws in Springfield and impacting not just Cook County, but the entire state. First, we raised the age. Young people At the age of 17, we're going into the adult system and into the adult jail. We raised the age so that at their 18th birthday, they go into the adult system and the adult jail. And that's really important because the juvenile justice system is focused on rehabilitation and the adult system is focused on punishment. So we need to keep people in the juvenile system as long as possible. There was something called automatic transfers. Automatically, for the accusation of a certain crime, you went into the adult system. And we dramatically reduced the number of crimes that would send young people into the adult system. Again, because the adult system focuses on punishment and the juvenile system focuses on rehabilitation. And our most significant success, with the support of many of you in this room, was automatic expungements for juvenile records for most of their crimes. All misdemeanors and most felonies are now if you meet your probation requirements, are now automatically expunged. And expungement is critical because if you have a record, it can impede your ability to get scholarships, to get housing, and life chances. So the work that we did in Springfield in conjunction with so many of you has really impacted the juvenile justice system, and I'm very grateful for all your help and support.
Lori Lightfoot.
Well, for me, these issues are very personal. Some of you know that the brother that's closest in age to me and that I was closest to growing up spent most of his life locked up in prison, the last of which was 17 years in federal prison for a drug case. He's now a 62-year-old man and struggles every single day because he has no history of work and a high school degree. I also was fortunate enough through the work of my firm to provide pro bono legal assistance to a young man who was locked up at age 19, spent almost 20 years incarcerated for a murder and an attempt murder that he didn't commit. So I really care deeply about these issues, and the city of Chicago simply isn't leading. If you look at the city's website, there's very little information around the returning citizen population, what the city can do, and we have to change that around. Programs like being led by Arnie Duncan and his colleagues and at Heartland Alliance are working with this population, but the numbers that they touch are way too small. The city has to have skin in this game to make sure that we're providing services to provide them with soft skills, wraparound services, and lead to real jobs. The other thing that we have to think about is how do we stop the pipeline? We need to invest in children at the earliest stage of their life to give them real options and opportunity. The fact of the matter is, in way too many neighborhoods across our city, the illegal drug trade is the largest employer. And to the extent that that continues to be the reality, we're going to keep losing. We've got to turn that around by doing the kind of investments that we talked about in previous response to previous questions. But we also can't turn our back on these men, mostly men, who are coming home into circumstances that were no better or worse than what they left. And we've got to provide them hope and opportunity so they have connection to the legitimate economy. And the city can't ignore this, has to lead, has to put its own resources into this to build up the resources that are already being invested by private entities.
Once again, the hashtag is Communities Striving for Peace and Prosperity, or hashtag 100 Black Men Mayors Forum, or Invest Shy Mayors Forum. Speaking of social media, right now we're going to hear from Jayla. Jayla, where are you? Okay, great. You have a question from Twitter, I guess. Very good. We'll begin with you, Lori Lightfoot, on that.
Well, it's a great question because it means that we have to think about the process of learning as something that, other than the hours that children are in school. I'm happy to say that my wife has been a big proponent of creating a series of after-school programs that have gotten national recognition. She helped create U-Media that started at the Harold Washington Library and was the home for launching Chance the Rapper's music career. But we've got, in Chicago City of Learning, there's the Digital Youth Network that are doing a lot of great things to really provide support and resources to kids to help them learn, give them skills that will enable them to get to jobs. So if you look at our education policy, we talk a lot about the need to think expansively about providing those kind of resources throughout the city of Chicago in our neighborhoods that are most economically distressed, so kids have something to latch onto and provide them opportunity to dream beyond their current circumstances. There again, that's a smart investment in our young people at the earliest stages to give them exposure to STEM, to give them exposure to math and science, but also the arts. And other things that expand the notion of learning to make it fun and not just focus on the testing and the college or bus mentality that unfortunately pervades way too much of our educational system now.
Madam President.
You know, I'm a teacher by profession. I spent 10 years in the classroom. And you know, all of us in this country ought to be ashamed of how little we invest in our children. We invest more in people in our prisons than we do in our public schools. I'll say that again. We invest more in our prisons than we do in our public schools, particularly our public schools in communities of color, in our urban areas, in our rural public schools. The kids who get the most invested in them are the kids in privileged communities, which is just the reverse of what we need. We have to make it a priority to invest in our young people and to support public education. And let me just say, you know, I've always said the schools should be open, you know, from 7 or 8 in the morning till 8 or 9 at night. And the reason is that many of our kids do not come to school with breakfast, and I'm glad we now have in Illinois breakfast available to our young people. And they don't have dinner when they get home. We should feed our kids in school. We should be sure that they have before and after school programming. And we need to invest in keeping our schools open, as I said, for a 12-hour period. You know, the time in which most young people get in trouble, it's between 4 and 7. And what is that time? It's the time between when their parents get home and school gets out. We need to invest in programs like After School Matters, which does wonderful arts programming and science programming in our schools. We need to invest in programs like Merit Music and the Chicago Children's Choir, which bring arts programming into our schools. The kind of programming that privileged parents pay for, and many of our families cannot afford to provide for their children. You know, as a teacher, as I said, I've been discouraged and disappointed that this country, particularly over the last several decades, has not been willing to invest in our young people in the way that we really need investment.
Ms. Lightfoot, the question was from Twitter.
Yeah, I answered it first.
Oh, you did?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Hey, even the moderator makes a
Listen, when
mistake.
you call my name like that, I'm checking myself to make sure I'm all right.
But I did have a question for you. It has to go to my mental health.
That's okay.
And,
You're fine.
It's pretty good, I guess. But on a serious note here, it comes from Pedro Martinez with Catholic Charities, and it says, what are your plans when considering mental health resources as a tool for combating gun violence in the neighborhoods of Chicago? We'll begin with you, Toni.
We have some real challenges around behavioral health in this country. When we created our county care program, our Medicaid expansion program, which grows out of the Affordable Care Act, President Obama's wonderful legacy, we included behavioral health services because we knew that our patients needed social emotional support, they needed substance abuse and addiction treatment. So we made, for the first time, behavioral health services available to our patients. We also acquired in the last several years a not-for-profit organization called C4 on the north side so we could further expand the services that we're able to deliver. You know, and the city of Chicago's record on this is not very good. They've been closing mental health clinics. And they sold that to the people of the city of Chicago as a cost-saving measure. And I always say it's not cost-saving, it's cost-shifting. Because what happens when you don't provide treatment for people in their communities, they end up without therapy, without meds, and they often end up in our emergency room at Stroger Hospital in crisis or in some other hospital emergency room in crisis, or they end up in our criminal justice system because they've been acting out. So closing down mental health clinics is not saving money, it's cost shifting. And as the city closed down, I think 7 of its 12 clinics, some of our community-based organizations stepped up to try to meet the need. And of course, our health and hospital system, through its county care program, has been providing these services as well. So we need to reopen clinics. We need to look strategically at where that makes sense and where we can support the community-based organizations that have stepped up to fill the void. And we need to understand that there's a great unmet need for behavioral health services in our communities, particularly around trauma. In the communities in which there's so much violence, we struggle with trauma for all age groups, children, adults, all age groups. And I want to commend Kwame Raoul, who said we need to provide treatment centers in our communities for people who struggle with the effects of violence in their neighborhoods. And he's trying to get the state of Illinois to support that effort.
Mrs. Lightfoot?
Let me answer the question by framing a recent experience. You will recall the Parkland incident, and there was a major march in Washington. There was also a protest here, March for Our Lives. And many of our young people took the stage, person after person, to talk about their own personal experiences with violence. Losing a sibling, losing a family member, losing a friend in school. And what that underscored for me is that so many of our young people across this city are experiencing a level of trauma as if they are veterans, have gone multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. And you see young children where the light starts to go out by the time they're 3 or 4 or 5 years old because of the trauma that they're experiencing on a daily basis. Of course, we need to redress the wrong that was done in closing the clinics, but the truth is those clinics were only serving a very narrow band of the population that needed the kind of help and care and mental health and trauma. So what we need to do is think more expansively about that. Absolutely, we need to expand the offerings from the Department of Public Health. It's way too small, relies primarily on grant funding, but we also need to connect up with the network of community-based providers to make sure that we've got a seamless network of offerings for people in the community so they don't have to drive or take public transportation way outside of their neighborhoods to seek the care that they need. We, of course, need to make sure that we continue to expand CIT training, crisis intervention training for our police officers, so that they understand and are able to recognize issues that they're experiencing in calls for service. I think we got to move towards a co-responder process that's available in cities like Oakland, where we've got trained clinicians who are responding to these distress calls that are coming over 911. But we've got to think expansively about the way in which we heal the wounds that are there in our community.
This question is actually going to come from me, and recently we saw an egregious abuse of power and celebrity associated with those individuals that were arrested for influence peddling in terms of getting their children, many times who, at least according to the indictments, were not able to get into some of the nation's top schools. Both of you are graduates of the University of Chicago. I can tell you, and I'm pretty sure it may in a sense speak for you, but I am a product of affirmative action, being the first one to ever graduate from college in my entire extended family. When we look at what happened recently with that news story, and we look at this dilution of a commitment to affirmative action, what would your administration do to put teeth back into those laws that in many ways were a product of the Johnson War on Poverty program and were in fact instituted by Richard Nixon? We'll begin with you, Toni Preckwinkle.
For the last year and a half, we've engaged in a process in county government looking at the issue of equity and trying to figure out how we can use equity as a lens through which to look at all of what we do in Cook County government. Now, clearly, most of our money goes into our health and hospital system and our criminal justice system. And we're very proud of the fact that our health and hospital system for 180 years has taken anyone who comes to our door. So the issue there of whether or not you have insurance, whether or not you're documented, you can come to our health and hospital system and be served. And that's, of course, an equity issue. Are we going to provide health care for all of our people? In the criminal justice system, we clearly have some equity issues. We know that the population of Cook County is about 50% black and brown, and yet 86% of the people in our jail, 86% of the people in our jail are black and brown. We have to use an equity lens as we look at our problems, whether it's health care and criminal justice in the county, or how we use our resources and how we do our budgeting in the city, because your budget reflects your values. And if we're not putting money, for example, into the criminal justice office in the mayor's office, the violence prevention office, and basically what they've done, although they created the office, they only put a couple $100,000 extra in it. They took grants that they had been line items elsewhere in the budget and then just put them in that office of criminal justice. We need to invest in criminal justice reform through the mayor's office. That's one way in which we can deal with the equity issue, and we have to look at how resources are allocated more broadly. What are the kinds of investments that are being made, for example, by the Department of Transportation in communities, and how do they reflect an equity lens? We've got to use equity as the lens through which we look at how the city spends its money and the programs and services that it delivers.
And Lori Lightfoot.
Well, let me talk about this in a couple of different contexts. The underlying premise of your question is about education. We see that manifest in many ways in the city of Chicago, and particularly in CPS, and we've talked at length about them, but let me focus on the selective enrollment process. We see these high schools that are some of the best in the nation now, far exceeding high schools that have traditionally been at the top of the list, but when you look at the population, they are not open in the way that they should be to black and brown students in the city. So that's a fundamental problem. We know that in areas of the city, particularly on the west side, the kinds of offerings of college prep, other training, and just basic programming doesn't exist because of equity issues. So we've got to correct that. But I also want to talk about it in the context of building wealth in our city. The city of Chicago spends about $2 billion every single year procuring goods and services. And we are not doing what we need to do to make sure that government contracting is equitably distributed and that we're providing real opportunity to minority and women-owned and veterans-owned businesses. And that's something that we can correct. I know this worked very well from my time as the first deputy of procurement, where we went in and tried to solve this problem. So we've got to break down those contracts so that small businesses and minority businesses can take them on their own without saying, "Mother, may I," to a larger prime. We need to be calling the question of supplier diversity to the people that we do business with, to ask them what are they doing to hire these same kinds of businesses and build wealth. We need to lower the barriers to access to capital so that our companies can actually get funding that they need to start businesses, to expand business opportunities, and we need to build incubator opportunities in our neighborhoods so that small businesses can thrive. Those are some of the other equity things that I think we need to be focused on.
The next question comes from Mary Sonor Sanders, Strives for Peace, and she says, nonprofit organizations on the front lines of community violence contend with fragmented, unstable funding streams. How would you work to reform funding for gun violence prevention and intervention that will provide collaboration and sustainable outcomes at the community-based organization level? We'll begin with you first, Toni.
Let me just say, this is work that we have been doing in the county for the last 6 years, trying to support organizations that do anti-violence, anti-recidivism, and restorative justice work. And we've spent about $18 million doing that. And it's important funding. And as we got into it, we realized that we needed to do multi-year funding to provide more stable support for the community-based organizations that were doing this work. And let me just say, we got into this funding because we realized that we were spending hundreds of millions of dollars on our jail and our criminal justice system and our courts, but we weren't spending any money on trying to slow down the pipeline of young people into our criminal justice system. So I'm very proud of the work that we've begun to do there. The city needs to step up considerably. As I said, the Office of Violence Prevention or Criminal Justice Reform in the mayor's office ought to be funded at the $30 to $35 million level. I'm very grateful that the foundation and corporate community have stepped up through partnering for safe and peaceful communities to support some of this anti-violence and anti-recidivism work that needs to be done in the absence of city support, because this is the first year that the city has had any kind of Office of Violence Prevention and looked at this and attempted to look at this in a holistic way. So I think it's important that Government, step up. We're very grateful for the support of the foundation and corporate community, but government really has to step up to do this funding if we're going to make a real impact in these communities. And I want to say that I think that the support of the foundation community partnering for safe and peaceful communities has made a real difference. It's one of the contributors to the fact that although we had a high point in murders in 2016 and 2017 and 2018, those numbers have come down. And as I said, I'm very grateful for the work that's been done by those organizations, but I think that the government itself, the city, has to step up in the same way the county did to support these community-based organizations and the work that they do.
Lori Lightfoot.
Well, I think about it from this perspective. Our violence numbers started to go radically up in late 2015 and into 2016. What was happening at that time? We had a budget impasse in Springfield. Now, I'm not a social scientist, but to me, it's common sense that when Springfield failed to fund community-based organizations that were out there supporting individuals, families, young children, it made sense, unfortunately, that when those services got retrenched or just went away entirely, what we saw is this chaos of violence. Now, we need to make sure, of course, that there's never a budget impasse again. And as the mayor of Chicago, I think that's got to be a primary responsibility. But we also need to make sure that we give recognition to the groups that are doing the Lord's work out there to stop the retaliation, to really reach the folks who are causing the violence, help them get out of the life. Groups like Arnie Duncan's, Rick Estrada, Eddie Bocanegra, and other groups, Toni Gross, I think, is here as well, that are working with communities, funded in part and almost largely by the philanthropic community. But I agree, the city has to have more skin in the game. We will never fight violence effectively. We will never have long-term solutions if we continue to focus on a law enforcement first and only strategy. That's why I've said continuously, this is a public health crisis. We have to look at the root causes of the violence, and we have to reach people where they are. And one of the effective ways of doing that is making sure that some of the organizations that I've counted out, and others, Diane Latimer is here and does incredible work in her community with Kids Off the Block. We need to make sure that those kind of programs are fully funded and that there's recognition for the hard work that's being done and the sacrifices that are being made by individuals all over the city who are putting themselves on the front line. The city has to be a partner with them.
As well as organizations like the 100 Black Men of Chicago, right?
There we
Indeed.
go.
But the last question here, because I appreciate everybody being on time, and we're going to make sure that we try to end on time, but it has to deal with what would you do to stem this loss of civility that exists in our society today? We see people engaging in tribalism, aligning themselves with a certain religious belief or gender inequality or some sort of white supremacy. And we see that it rears its ugly head over and over again. We're a nation that is not a melting pot, but more or less a salad bowl, where all of the ingredients come together and still maintain their unique fragrances and properties. With that said, what would you do to restore civility to our public discourse? We'll begin with you, Toni Preckwinkle.
You know, we have a real challenge in our country at this point in time because we have a president of the United States who epitomizes incivility, who denigrates our immigrant population, suggests that people coming here from Mexico are all rapists and murderers, who denigrates the Muslim faith, who, of course, makes racist and sexist comments, suggesting in Charlottesville that there were good people on both sides when white supremacists were marching through the streets with torches, saying the Jews will not replace us. It's a real challenge to those of us who value our diversity and inclusion, that we have a president of the United States who behaves in this despicable way. And those of us in public life have to take a stand. We have to stand up for our immigrant communities. We have to stand up for our religious minorities. Because if we don't do that, we're lending credence and support to the President of the United States and the despicable views that he holds. It's really important in this difficult time that we be what the Holocaust Museum calls upstanders as opposed to bystanders, that we be people who speak up for those who are being denigrated on the basis, as I said, of religion or national origin or immigration status. It's really important for us to be champions of those who are being denigrated, because we can't have a country in which people's differences of race, religion, ethnic origin are disparaged, because the moment, the moment we consent to the disparagement of others, you know, it comes back to us next. It's really important that those of us in public life stand up for civility and stand up for the people in our society who are presently the subject of so much hatred and vitriol.
Ms. Lightfoot.
Well, it's an interesting question in the context of this mayor's race, where I have been the subject of dog whistles, homophobic, racist comments. I think that we lead by example, and that we do not empower anyone who favors us to denigrate somebody else who has a different point of view. We have 2 weeks left in this election. What people I know want to hear from us is, what is your message for change? What is your vision for uplifting the quality of neighborhoods? How will you empower us to reach our highest and best potential? And it's certainly my hope in the waning days of this most historic and important election that each of us will focus on answering that question and call. Our children are watching, our city is watching, our nation is watching, and it's incumbent upon us to speak our values, not just in rhetoric, but in deeds, and to make sure that everybody who is associated with these movements for change are on the same page, that it's got to be positive, it's got to be imbued with hope, and for me, it's got to be a message of change and optimism and how we can respond to the needs of these people in the city who are hungry for a different kind of government and a different kind of leadership. That is the opportunity and the challenge that we face in the waning days of this election. I'm going to do my part to uplift the quality of the debate and to make sure that we are focused on the issues that are most important to people's lives every single day.
And that sounds like a great closing comment there, but I was wanting the civility piece, because I'm going to afford you the opportunity now, Lori, in terms of a minute, to issue a closing what?
I think that was somebody's radio.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
You guys have been great on the cell phone. In terms of a closing comment.
Well, first of all, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. I appreciate the organizers bringing this forum together. I think the questions have been probing and appropriate, and really speaking to, I think, the issues that people want to hear from us. We have an opportunity in now less than 2 short weeks to really speak our values in a way that answer the call of people all over the city who want to hear about hope, who want to hear about change. And I stand as a Democrat, but a different kind of Democrat, who is independent, who cares about reform, cares about making government transparent and responsive to the needs of the people and accountable. Now that scares some people who are very tied to the status quo. But I know from the people I've heard from in every neighborhood of the city that the time is now for us to bring change to our city. The same old, the status quo has failed way too many people, and it's time for us to break from that past and move forward for a different kind of Chicago. Thank you.
Ms. Preckwinkle.
Thank you very much to the sponsors, to Malcolm X College, and for all of you for joining us today. You know, I've spent my life in public service. I started out as a teacher. I spent 10 years in the classroom. I worked for not-for-profit organizations. I worked in the Harold Washington administration in the Department of Economic Development. I spent 19 years as alderman of the 4th Ward and the last 8 years as Cook County Board President. And I'm proud of the trajectory of my life. Public service, that's what I've done. And you know, I think of myself as a change agent, because what I did when I came into the 4th Ward was change the paradigm there. We invested in the communities that have been struggling for decades, and we worked hard to improve the public schools in all of our communities, to rebuild neighborhoods that were filled with vacant lots and abandoned buildings, and to change the safety of the streets and to ensure that people felt safe in their homes and in their communities. That kind of transformative work is difficult, it's challenging, and you have to involve the community in that process. It can't be something that you do by fiat or by waving a magic wand. It's the difficult work of engaging the community and working with the community to improve our neighborhoods. As County Board President, I've committed to making our healthcare system sustainable and criminal justice reform, and that's what we've done over the last 8 years. You know, whether or not our healthcare system would survive was kind of touch and go when I walked in the door. And now for the first time in the last several years, it's in the black, having been for more than a century in the red. And I'm very proud of the fact that we deliver care to anyone who comes to our door. Anyone who comes to our door, regardless of their ability to pay, regardless of their documentation status. And in the criminal justice system, I've worked hard with the stakeholders to reform that system and to be sure that people who are accused of nonviolent crimes, and that's many black and brown young men, get to spend the time between their arrest and the disposition of their case out in the community rather than sitting in our jail. That work is difficult, but it's transformative, just as the work that we did to sustain our healthcare system was transformative. It's easy to talk about change, it's hard to actually do it, and that's what I've spent my adult life doing, making transformative changes.
Thank you very much. Can we give them a round of applause? Before you go out, please stay right where you are. We're going to have closing comments right now. So one of the nation's foremost advocates for education has dedicated his life to it, and that is former Education Secretary Arne Duncan.
Thank you so much. We have another huge round of applause for our two candidates, Toni Preckwinkle and Lori Lightfoot. A couple quick thank yous and then 3 requests, and we'll get out of here. To all of our everyone here, to all of our viewers at home, everyone at watch parties, this was a thoughtful, serious conversation. Thank you for your time and for your leadership. Please give another round of applause to our moderator, Darryl Dennard, who did a fantastic job. I want to thank our co-sponsor, the 100 Black Men. They were a wonderful, wonderful partner of me when I led Chicago Public Schools. We look forward to doing a lot more work together. I want to thank our young men who are here, who are helping to reduce violence here in Chicago. They are the solution. They are not the problem. We need to listen to them and walk with them. Hopefully you got copies of their autobiographies. I want you to understand both their pain, but also their promise and their potential and how much leadership they're providing every single day. So please go home and take a look at those books. 3 quick requests. Please vote. Please vote. It's so easy for us to critique. It's so easy for us to throw stones. We have to step up. The number of people who voted in the primary was actually very, very low in the city. We need to come out and vote. Secondly, whoever wins, we need Chicago to win. This is a historic election. Whoever wins, we're going to have, for the first time in Chicago's history, a strong black woman leading our city. These issues are too serious. The challenges are too great. We can get back to politics 4 years from now. For the next couple of years, let's roll up our sleeves. Let's all find a way to work together to get Chicago to a better place. And then finally, please help us continue to reduce gun violence in the city. Chicago is 7 times more violent than New York. Chicago is 3 to 4 times more violent than LA. Chicago has more police officers per capita than both of those cities. Our young people are living with a level of trauma and fear that is absolutely unacceptable. I'm in schools every couple of weeks on the south and west sides. Every time I ask classrooms with kids, how many of you know someone who's been shot and killed? Almost every time, 100% of hands go up. I ask how many know 5, 10, 15, 20 people. Often half the hands in the room are still up. Our children live on the south and west sides. They don't live in Iraq. They don't live in Afghanistan. They don't live in what we call war zones, but those are war zones. We have to get better. We have to let children grow up free of fear and give them their childhoods back. As we heard, 2016 was our worst year in terms of violence. 2017 was down 15%. 2018 was down 15%. That's real progress. We have a long way to go. Our goal for 2019 is to have a 30% reduction in violence. That would take us below 400 homicides here in Chicago. Let me be clear, that is still far, far, far too high, but that would be the first time since 1965 that we'd be below 400 homicides in Chicago. We need to hit that benchmark, keep working over the next couple of years to get our rates down to New York and LA. Thank you for your hard work. Thank you for your commitment. Thanks to both our candidates for coming back out.